Ladies, gentlemen, I want to talk about the PR disaster Delta Airlines has been for Berkshire Hathaway, and I want to break down the timeline in Warren Buffett's bull thesis leading up to this moment of them liquidating their shares. I'm sure you've heard about the news, but before we get into all of that, let's just talk about some housekeeping rules and what is just going on with Berkshire Hathaway. If we take a look at their stock, their A-class stocks, they're only down roughly, if I can get this to line up here, about 22%, give or take. And if we compare it to the S&P 500, well, the S&P is actually down 26%, which came to a bit of a shock to me still, considering if you scroll through their portfolio holdings, most of them are down a lot more than 20%. And the most fascinating part of their holdings is if you take a look at their newest stocks, guys, they're like the most recession-proof stocks and investments that a lot of us would consider making in these times, considering they're buying the indexes, both the SPY and the VOO, which both represent the S&P 500. Kroger, BIIB, two companies that are performing exceptionally well. They're actually green during this volatile pandemic. So I found that very fascinating because nobody's talking about these new holdings that they're undertaking. They're very usual and safe stocks. So I found that kind of interesting. And just a couple of their airline holdings like DAL and LUV combined, I think make somewhere between 3 and 5% of the entire portfolio with all of their airlines combined. But talking about Delta specifically, I wanted to deep dive a little farther into this to see if I could wrap my head around some of it. But taking a look at Delta's CEO said that they're losing about $60 million a day, which to a conglomerate, a multi-billion-dollar airline, you'd think, heck, that can't be that bad. But if you run the math going into their total cash position in their balance sheet being about $2.8 billion, if we divide that out by that $60 million a day, that means that their cash position is going to evaporate over the next 48 days, and we've already been eating through that. Clearly, Delta is in somewhat of a mess that they have to kind of resolve here, considering they filed for the bailout for the government, but do they deserve it? That's the real question, considering they're not even following like base investment advice that individuals try and put onto themselves. They're living in this whole little realm of like everything was working perfectly, there's no way anything bad, this is like a necessity to life, and man, do crashes really slap people upside of the face. So in light of that, I want to break down the timeline going back to last year when Warren Buffett was kind of giving his bull thesis on the airlines, and I want to kind of lead up to a couple of videos that talk about what is going on now, and then I'm going to give you my personal opinion. So ladies and gentlemen, let's jump right into this.
Drop it.
Airlines, an area that you had sworn off, you went back into pretty heavily a few years ago. You now own major stakes in American, United, Southwest, and Delta. And in the most recent filings, it showed that you had bought even more shares in Delta. It pushed you above 10%. When I just talked to you a couple of months ago, you said you generally try not to push above 10%. What happened?
Well, that was an interesting situation. Delta made an appearance, I don't know, 3 weeks ago or at some investment conference, and I think they announced they'd bought in 26 or 27 million shares and borrowed $1 billion to do it. Well, I like that in two aspects. They'd bought in 4% of their stock, so all of a sudden we own 4% more of Delta than we had the day before. I like the fact they were willing to borrow $1 billion to accelerate a stock repurchase program. But what I didn't realize was that purchase had taken us over 10%, so I was already in territory that I didn't plan to get. So I just decided to buy a whole lot more stock. I mean, once I'd lost my virginity, essentially, I thought, why stop at one, you know?
Does that mean you like Delta better than the other airlines at this point?
No, I accidentally went above 10%. And if you look at the number of airlines that went broke in this country, if you look at the number of auto manufacturers that went broke, I mean, the capitalism can be rough. It produces good results overall, but it is survival of the fittest. But the airline industry is a very, very competitive business, and it'll always be a very competitive business. I don't think it's a suicidal business anymore, but it was for quite a while.
Welcome back, my passive income investors alike. So Warren Buffett is clearly biting his own tongue today after talking about his insanely bullish mood around the airline stocks and how they no longer were graveyard stocks because back in the day, they were real killers to your portfolio if you were holding them. Clearly, still the case today, guys. Considering this video was posted at the end of March in 2019, we really are skipping forward an exact year here to this very moment. And going all the way forward to this year at this time, guys, literally not even a month ago, Warren Buffett was buying more shares in Delta. We can just read this from March 3rd. Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, bought up more Delta shares. Warren Buffett scooped up more Delta share stock last week as the shares tumbled while the market tilted into correction territory. Entities owned by Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, paid 45 million shares on February 27th for a total of 976,000 Delta Airlines shares with an average price of $46.40. I'm not going to read through all of this article. It's just going to go over the total allotted shares that they hold. But this is really unusual for a company like this, especially portfolio managers, to be buying and being so bullish on an airline company to only not even a couple of weeks later, leading to this very moment where they're literally just flipping them back at a loss. So I want you to listen to this other little CNBC tidbit that it's really odd how we're all trying to speculate on it. So I'm going to give you my opinion after you listen to this little sub piece because it touched base on some stuff that I just don't believe is true. But let's just take a quick listen. Let me turn this on for you guys.
This news came out late this afternoon, and here's what Berkshire Hathaway did. They sold some of their position with Delta and Southwest. And the reason they had to disclose this in an SEC filing is because they had above 10% of the shares, and they had to go below 10%, which required them to announce that they were selling. Now, we don't know their final position in terms of what any other stock moves they may have made with other airline stocks that they own. We have reached out to Berkshire Hathaway. We have not heard a response from them, which is not uncommon. Whenever they make a move regarding a particular stock, they never say why they decided to either buy or sell that stock. But this move comes on a day when the big six airlines, and other airlines as well, have all applied to the federal government for a piece of the $25 billion in cash grants that will be awarded to them sometime over the next week to week and a half from the federal government. They have all filed those applications. We're not sure who's going to end up with how much or what the position will be from the federal government in terms of taking stock warrants or some kind of a stake in each of the airlines. But what's noteworthy is two announcements today. One from Delta CEO Ed Bastian, where he announced that they have applied for this application, or they filed the application for grants, and yet at the same time he says, look, we're still bleeding cash. They're going through $60 million a day, and it's not much better at the other airlines. JetBlue CEO Robin Hayes also announcing that they've applied for the federal cash grant. They're going through $10 million in cash per day. And to give you some sense, Scott, that things may not improve in the future, today United filed an SEC 8K, and in it they said that their fourth quarter projection, is that revenue will be down 30%. That's with a recovery. That's the kind of recovery they're looking at, Scott. 30% drop in revenue. As of right now, that's what they're expecting in the fourth quarter.
Look, guys, this just doesn't make any sense. Warren Buffett has been owning more than 10% of some of these companies for quite some time. So for the FCC to just step up and say, look, you have to sell these or something along that nature wouldn't make any sense. And it just doesn't, the whole timeline doesn't come together to understand what that exact decision was that led them into this moment. Because how can you buy shares just literally not even a month before only to have to sell it at a major loss? And it just can't have to do with the whole the stake holdings they have. Now, I could be wrong about that, and we won't find out until the beginning of May when Berkshire releases those quarterly reports on why they made those decisions. This is not a small mistake for a large investor, so they would have had to have a serious meeting that led into this moment and probably some arguments, again, considering they just purchased the stock. So what is my personal opinion on this? I honestly think it has to do with just protecting shareholders. I think something drastic has changed in the airline industry that is going to shock shocked them for a while. And I know a lot of us out there have been really talking up the airlines like Boeing and Delta and all of these different companies that we could buy into because they seem unbelievably cheap. But the question is how fast is this recovery going to come into play? We can see going into the 2008 financial crisis that it took roughly 3 or 4 years for the airlines to fully recover from it. And at this point in time is when Buffett was going on about how these airline companies are like graveyard stocks. It's really hard to get capital out of them. And we might be going back to that pace in time because, I mean, the money that these companies are going to be taking aren't just bailout money. There's going to be debt repayment that they're going to have to do over time, and how this is going to affect them in the near term. And when I'm talking about near term, I'm saying the next 3 to 5 years. We're going to have to see how fast the airline industry picks up, which I think is going to be incredibly fast. So there are some lights at the end of this really jaggery tunnel that we're going through here with this company. I'm not personally buying it. I've been on the edge constantly on whether I should pick up shares in it just for the long term, but man, it is really convoluted when you're listening to these multi-billion-dollar fund managers going through this really insane process, and it is going to be so fascinating to see their opinions on it. But I honestly think it just could be them trying to protect shareholder money and them wanting to reallocate it, say, into the S&P, into Kroger, into those really safe, solid, sound companies that are going to stabilize the portfolio because, man, it has been performing pretty well, but there could still be some severe downside on these airline stocks depending on how bad this fallout is because clearly they weren't as well capitalized as they looked. And just like, oh man, I hate quoting Dave Ramsey all the time, but you gotta treat your business the same way you treat your personal finances. And if you couldn't prepare for a 3 to 6 month lockup and you only have the cash funds available to survive a month and a half at most, I mean, this is really slapping some light into the airline industry. This just really shows the insane aspects of businesses when it comes to protecting shareholders, doing these share buybacks, taking out debt to do share buybacks, only to lay off the entire employee staff just to protect the people that own the company. And it does not look good when a company goes through this. So how much is this going to hinder it? It's going to be real neat to see the fallout. And I'd love to know what you guys think about this in that comment section below. I'm still petering on the edge if I should buy some. I want to know, do you guys think I should be picking up some airline stocks right now? I'd love to hear it. But slap a like if you enjoyed this Sunday information. Stay cool, stay awesome, and I'll catch you guys tomorrow.